When I was young, I listened to the radio, waiting for my favorite
Welcome to the
songs.
internationally famous Radio Theatre.
When they played, I'd sing along. It made me smile. Those old melodies still sound so good to me as they melt the years away.
Here they come. Adrian Elsey.
When a girl marries.
Lux Radio Theatre. Good morning, boys. Hello, world.
Howdy, everybody.
Van Doogly.
Yibbity-yibbity, folks.
Good morning, Sandy Sparrow.
What do you say, guys?
It's huge. It is.
The cream of Australian radio talent.
All my best memories come back clearly to me. Some can even make me cry, just like before. It's yesterday once more.
This is Jack Davis saying good night and thanks for listening.
Hello, I'm Mike Hammond. Back in 1956, television came to Australia and quickly became the entertainment centre of the home. Radio, it seemed, was facing oblivion. But then suddenly a lucky combination of separate events brought salvation. And one of those was this miraculous technical innovation, the transistor radio. Here now to guide us into this part of our story is one of our leading radio commentators, Howard Sattler.
Thanks, Mike. If ever there was a perfect example of how timing can determine the fate of an industry, it's in the events that came together and overwhelmed Australian radio broadcasting in 1956. It was the coming of television and the transistor radio, combined with the arrival of my generation, the baby boomers. The gigantic wave of children born after World War II were about to come into their adolescent years. They were labelled with a new name, teenagers. No one realised it at the time, but our generation would go on to dominate most of the major trends in popular culture for years to come. And the first big trend came in the late 1950s. Radio suddenly gave us a new and exciting form of popular music.
Good evening and welcome to television.
Just as television was starting in Australia, at the same time, on the other side of the world, three of the brightest scientists of the 20th century were awarded the Nobel Prize for Physics. They were Americans William Bradford Shockley, Walter Brattain and John Bardeen. The prize was in recognition of their development of the seminal invention of the 20th century, the transistor. From this tiny miracle came the transistor radio and a revolution in broadcasting. The earlier introduction of the car radio, along with some heavy, battery-driven valve radios, had allowed broadcasting to be enjoyed outside the home. But the true salvation for radio came with the first low-priced 5-transistor pocket radio receiver. Truly portable radios connected us to continuous information, entertainment, and most importantly, for all those new teenagers, music. To play it for them, there emerged a new generation of slick-talking, ad-libbing announcers who became their heroes and the bright new stars of radio.
420209 is the only number to ring in 3AK's chart check. And let's move it now with the sun rays.
In its early days, the radio audience was clearly considered to comprise either adults or children.
You would have music for children. Forget the teenagers, they were not invented in those days. And music for adults. And it was the Bing Crosby, the Andrews Sisters and that style of music of the day.
But after World War II, radio developed a new style of specialty shows aimed at adolescents.
Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and teenagers everywhere. This is Howard Craven in... Well,
you go in and you win records and get chocolates and packets of Smith's chips, so that was great. So sometimes there was only 10 people there, you know, 10 kids in the afternoon. We'd sit round this, as I remember, in the TW studios, and so that was great. I loved that.
what's your name?
Veteran radio and TV host Philip Brady got his start auditioning for 3AW's Rumpus Time.
I remember walking up to St Pat's Cathedral and saying some prayers and then going back to the Russell Street Auditorium for the decision. And sure enough, I had won and they invited me in on the Saturday morning to play my favourite records.
Well, great big howdy-do, boys and girls, papas, mamas, grandmamas, grandpapas, uncles, aunties, in fact, everybody. This is Don Baker saying a big welcome once again to everybody to our show, Rumpus Time.
The audience would be there, you know, jam-packed in the studio, the large auditorium. And the same went for Rumpus Room in Brisbane with Norm Llewellyn, the Peters Pals Club, Coca-Cola Bottlers Club show with Alan Brandt.
As yet, there was no thought of radio music programs, especially for the teenage listener. When stations did make a feature of popular music, they confined it to the top 8 records of the week.
We'd had the likes of Bob Horsfall on UZ, Mike Williamson on 3AW. They played the 8 hits of the day. The TAA hit parade was 6 to 6:30 on a Sunday night with Mike Williamson, but that was only half an hour.
The first Australian announcer to play and comment on records was probably Alan Toohey. He was known for his perfect enunciation and clear tone, and he's still nominated by many as the greatest voice in Australian radio, and the inspiration for the star announcers who followed.
More than anybody, I wanted to be Alan Toohey. He had this most mellifluous voice.
Show Me the Way to Go Home from the album, Bert Camford album of instrumentals, Strangers in the Night. Beautiful instrumentals on the album. It's very nice, easy beat stuff all the way through. Lovely stuff.
The first announcers who made a feature of records were known as record jockeys because they would continually adjust the volume while they played, or, as it was known in the industry, ride the game.
His current hit called Yield Not to Temptation.
It was the colourful American broadcaster and wordsmith Walter Winchell who changed that to disc jockeys. When American rock and roll music began to appear on mainstream radio in the mid-1950s, the first Australian disc jockey to start playing it, and more importantly, talking about it, was Stan Rofe.
Yes, it sure is. Hi-de-hi, Victoria, and hello! My golly, it's good to be back, it really is.
A very young Bert Newton was Rofe's panel operator.
Stan was a lovely man, liked by everybody, and he was the first real disc jockey I'd ever come across.
They loved him in Melbourne. He was greatly loved.
But I still do feel that a radio a microphone switch is a curtain. You're on stage. Could you excuse me a minute? Good. On the greater 3 UZ now, 6 1/2 to 3. Miss Mary Ann Faithful that time with Summer Nights. UZ time, did I say 6 1/2 to 3? That's a little record too, by the way, by Mary Ann Faithful, Summer Nights, which reminds me they're not too far away, are they? Love those summer nights.
Another widely admired early disc jockey was Tony Withers, who began a pop music record show on 2SM in 1956.
He was the greatest personality on radio at the time, the daddy-o of the radio, calling you over the airwaves to the sea waves to present the Jansen's Surf Hit Parade. I mean, these are the days, mate. I mean, great days.
There were certain aspects of his life that he chose to keep to himself, which I think hurt him a bit. And I think he was... in fact, I know he was a very sensitive man, very, very sensitive man.
Withers eventually went to Britain, changed his name to Tony Windsor, and became a star disc jockey on offshore pirate radio stations.
Hi out there, Stan. It's great to be talking to you here in the studios of Radio Luxembourg, and knowing that this interview will be heard by my great colleague and pal. Don't like his style very much, but like him as a fella, and that's Bob Rogers. Hello, Bob.
With TV stealing radio's advertising revenue, some stations were put up for sale. Australia's oldest commercial station, 2UE, was sold to Stuart Lamb, owner of Newcastle's 2KO. Lamb immediately went to America, where stations were filling the airwaves every day with recorded popular music they called Top 40. This revolutionary new format was born when radio programmers Bill Stewart and Todd Storrs walked into a bar and heard teenagers repeatedly playing the same songs on a jukebox.
And the girl who had been serving them behind the bar came out with their tip money and started putting the money in and starting to play these records all over again. And they asked her why she was doing it. She said, because they're great. I love hearing them. I never get sick of hearing them, etc.
2UE launched Australia's first Top 40 format in March 1958. Its star disc jockey was Bob Rogers, who'd made the move from Brisbane's 4BH.
There was a young announcer on the station called Bill Gates, And Bill subsequently has had a very successful career as a programmer and radio announcer over the years. I don't know why he said it, but he said to me, well, why don't you say hi-de-ho-de everybody? Now, it was a play on Jack Davies' most famous hi-ho everybody.
Hi-de-ho-de everybody, this is Bob Rogers, and we'll be revving till 7 with stacks of wax and lots of platter chatter.
Top 40 was different, exciting, even revolutionary, and it was an instant hit. The only problem was maintaining a constant stream of the very latest hits from America.
I had a friend in San Francisco who used to send me all the records before anybody else. So that was my real secret of success. I had records no one else ever had.
That's why a lot of the record companies objected to us collectively, but me prominently, from playing records that weren't released, because as soon as we played them, if it was going to be a hit like the Purple People Eater or something, the kids would be out the next day at the record shop and they couldn't buy them.
Here are the Playboys on American Cameo to present Over the Weekend.
Think it over.
I used to listen to John Laws on the line from Sydney, and he'd get imported records from the Qantas pilots and give him details of what was happening in Las Vegas. And I'd go on half an hour later and go, here's Antoine Fats Domino, currently in the Sands in Las Vegas.
Famous rivalries began to develop between these powerful new celebrities of Top 40 radio. One of the most widely reported in the tabloid press was a so-called feud between Laws and Rogers.
Well, we didn't really have a feud. I mean, I had absolutely nothing in common with Bob, and he had nothing in common with me, so we just went our separate ways.
The new music format quickly spread around the country.
And so suddenly Lewis Bennett, who was manager of 3UZ, came up with the line, wherever you go, there's radio. And there became a very famous jingle.
Radio is everywhere with the people. Through town and country, the programs flow. Working people listen. Business people listen. Everyone listens to radio.
Top 40 is the music of the masses. There is no question of that. It's music that's selected by the people.
Top 40 was not all rock and roll, and to keep the older audience, many stations played only the more melodic hits. As radio entered the 1960s, some stations expanded the Top 40 to the Top 100 and went 24 hours. Individual star jocks were now required to be part of a team of on-air personalities.
None of us were real mates, but when we walked into a function, we walked in as the greater 3UZ. Don Rainsford, Don Lunn, Alan Lappin, Aki and Jackie, Bill Ackfield and Jackie Clancy.
That era was so exciting. The atmosphere at 45 Burke Street was just unbelievable.
One spectacular success was a team format called The Good Guys, which proved the launching pad for one of Australia's best-loved personalities.
Mike Walsh was, he was dux of Xavier College, I found out, and he'd done pharmacy at university. And he had this wide life experience, and I brought him on, and he accumulated the biggest figures since Jack Davey doing Nighttime.
He's a go-go, Mike Walsh, top of the dial, radio 2SM.
With Mike Walsh, when he was one of the good guys, and he was running a quiz one night, and he said, anyone who can play a gum leaf. So I rang up and he said, why don't you come in? So I went in, and that was the first time I met and worked with Mike Walsh.
There were good guys everywhere, except in Brisbane. They had their good guys much later in the piece, but 64, 65 was the big good guy time. And they were a team of disc jockeys, not unlike a pop group.
Another of the new stars was a young, blonde-haired, wild man called Ward Austin, who developed a string of famous expressions. Among them was his signature greeting, "Anytime you're ready, Pally," developed for him by one of his young panel operators, Brian Lehman.
It was a Sammy Davis Jr. Album, and he was doing an imitation of Dean Martin. And in his imitation of Dean Martin, he said, "Anytime you're ready, Pally."
He sort of unleashed himself, and became Ward, Pally, Austin, Rickapudi and Fandoogly, all these things, which sort of captured the imagination of the young kids.
And for all of those out there, from old Pally Austin, a Rickapudi and a Fandoogly.
What a terrible thing to say.
Thank you, Pally.
Good night, darling.
I love you.
But if the disc jockeys were the teenagers' heroes, radio also made stars of the singers and musicians, and even the songwriters and record producers. After all, the jocks, who were spinning the disc, were only on air for a few moments between the records. The real revolution in radio was in the music itself. Coming up next, the people who made the music. America had been producing almost all the Western world's pop music for decades. The early radio hit parades were dominated by jazz singers, big bands, the crooners such as Bing Crosby, Frank Sinatra, Perry Como and Doris Day, along with the later show tunes and various sentimental melodies. But by the mid-1950s, radio's new disc jockeys wanted to find new and exciting and, above all, young music. Our guide for this part of our history is one of Australia's most respected journalists and radio personalities, Ita Buttrose.
While most of my radio career has been in talk, I've always loved music, and I certainly grew up listening to the new latest pop music on radio. Rock and roll was rebellious music that appealed to the new teenager.
To get an idea of just how revolutionary the new music was on radio in the 1950s, we need to look back briefly at the music programs in radio's first 20 years. In Australia, the ABC broadcast classical music concerts by Australia's state orchestras. The commercial network staged more popular concerts and sing-alongs and talent contests, such as Australia's Amateur Hour, which ran for 20 years.
And KQ, 4KQ, had the Suburban and Country Talent Quest, where you would go out as a unit, technical, announcers and so forth, to a theatre or a hall in some country town or suburb of Brisbane and record the Talent Quest.
Amateur Hour and others like Australia's Hour of Song invariably topped the ratings, much like today's big television talent quests such as Australian Idol. Most prestigious of all was the Mobile Quest.
And that's how I developed my love of opera, because, of course, the Mobile Quest was the Hector Crawford show at 7:30 every Sunday night, and it was a wonderful thing, and that produced some of the great opera singers in the world.
Other live music shows featured big dance and swing bands, jazz rhythms, and the hit parades with celebrity singers and crooners. But by the dawn of the 1950s, a revolution in popular music was just around the corner. In America, a few street-smart music entrepreneurs began bribing disc jockeys to play records by young black singing groups. In Australia, the market was too small to support these questionable promotions, although many jocks did later receive what were euphemistically called gifts.
Yes, there was the odd gift. I think it was called contra. Beautiful word. Unfortunately, now with the bean counters about the place and the public listed companies, it's very hard to get contra. However, there are ways. There was a lot of contra. I don't think I ever put my hand in my pocket for a restaurant, ever.
The black rhythm soon combined with white melodies, and in 1956, the opening titles of a hit movie sent Rock Around the Clock to the top of the charts.
When Rock Around the Clock was released, Blackboard Jungle, I went to see that, and like so many others, I came away thinking, that is a great sound. Wow, I like that.
In Australia, young musicians enthusiastically copied the American rock and roll.
With Johnny O'Keefe and Cole and Lonnie Lee, Johnny Rebb, Johnny Devlin, Deltones, people like that infiltrated into the record business, into top 40. Then, of course, they
got a spot on the stadium shows with Lee Gordon, and often they were better than the imported acts.
The star disc jockeys had enormous power to make a hit.
You become part of this image of 3UZ land.
There were 10 people in the meeting, the music meeting each week. We all contributed. We all had to vote as to which records would go on, which records would come off.
Then came the 1960s and worldwide Beatlemania. And Australian radio made sure it was at the centre of the excitement.
I'll never forget Bob Rogers walking into 2SM one day, and this was just on the edge of the good guy era, and saying there's a group from Manchester in England, Liverpool, wherever it was, he wasn't quite sure, and they're going to be the biggest thing of all time. And he was talking about the Beatles. And we decided, OK, we'll go with them.
How will Sydney react? Thursday morning will tell as the good guys join with 2SM's vast new staff to bring you an hour's vivid account of their arrival.
From 8 prominent broadcasting positions at Mascot Airport, 2SM's broadcasting team of 16 will swing into action to provide a never-to-be-forgotten radio coverage. Thursday morning at 6:15 is Beatle Hour. Join us.
2SM is excitement.
In 1964, a national syndicate of stations sent Bob Rogers to England to join up with the Beatles for their Australian tour. Being on the inside with the biggest rock group in the world had some dramatic moments.
And suddenly the police arrived with a battering ram. Now, I don't know, it looked like a short telephone pole, and they bashed the door down, and there was a girl who'd slashed her wrists because she couldn't meet the Beatles.
The power of radio's celebrity disc jockeys was proved in Adelaide when Bob Francis organised a massive petition to persuade promoter Ken Brodziak to extend the Beatles tour to Adelaide.
And I got 80,000 signatures brought into the station. They were in boxes, in wrap-ups, in everything. And I put the whole lot together and sent a telegram to Ken Brodziak saying I was sending it. And he got it, and he was quite amazed that he sent me a telegram, and I've got the telegram, and it says, due to response in Adelaide, Beatles now coming and appearing at the Centennial Hall.
The new rock music that stormed in with the Beatles brought yet another wave of Australian teen idols created almost entirely by radio DJs like Stan Rofe.
He really connected with the musicians, the up-and-coming pop singers, particularly Normie Rowe. But the new groups of the time, like the Masters Apprentices and the Zoot, Johnny Farnham, Russell Morris, all those people, Stan loved to play their records and give encouragement to these young up-and-coming artists. So he's a very important figure in pop radio in this country.
Australian pop music got an unexpected boost in 1970 when radio stations refused to pay extra fees for British records and banned them from airplay. Instead, radio played cover versions of the latest British hits by local Australian singers and bands, supplied by a rebel Melbourne record company, Fable.
You had people like Liv Mason singing Knock Knock Who's There, and the Mixtures doing In the Summertime, and that's how a lot of those bands got their start.
Knock, knock, who's there? Lots of Australian talent. 2SM's door is open wide.
While American and British music always dominated Australian radio playlists, some radio stations, like the ABC's Triple J and Adelaide's 5KA, made a point of promoting Australian rock bands. In the 1980s, the advent of music video had many again predicting the demise of radio. But again, it survived. And even today, with 24-hour music TV and pocket music players stacked with thousands of songs, music radio retains an audience of millions.
Now, digital radio is just the most exciting thing because it will be better than your record player. There won't be any interference, there won't be any crackling. It'll be the most genuine, clear sound of all time.
Ironically, the new clear digital radio transmission is possible thanks to the computer chip, the revolutionary offspring of that first transistor that saved radio in the 1950s. Coming up next, a look at how radio has helped us start each day and the stars they called the kings of the cornflakes.
Sitting on top of the world.
Mr. Royston?
Yes?
Come here.
What?
Get on with it.
Like me, pig.
I think I just did.
Story. Now, just be quiet for one moment.
This is Noddy.
Is Noddy at his car.
Ever since broadcasting began, the programming has been designed to fit in with daily routine. And for commercial stations, no radio session has been more lucrative or more competitive than breakfast. To usher in our look at the talented men and women who've hosted Australia's many breakfast shows over the years, here's one of the legends of radio, Bob Rogers.
Thank you, Ida. When I started out in radio, the peak listening was in the evening when families had time to relax and gather around that big wireless set in the living room. But with car, transistor and clock radios, it was the breakfast session that became the time when everyone could listen to radio. It offered us a bright and cheery start to the day.
In its early decades, radio was slow and deliberate in the mornings. There were some breakfast clubs and efforts to keep the pace of the shows reasonably light.
I used to listen to 3UZ back then, and Graham and Nicky, Graham Kennedy and Cliff Nichols, they were my heroes, and I can't remember why, but I think it's because they made me laugh.
As the pace of the music increased on radio, so stations soon began to mould personalities who could keep up a constant stream of news, humour, music, traffic information and time calls. In Sydney, Gary O'Callaghan took over the 2UE breakfast session in the 1950s and remained in the slot for more than 30 years. Most of those at the top of the ratings. And he was a one-man band.
Sydney 95 to you.
Quick check around, see what's doing. The trains and ferries are OK this morning. Sergeant Brown of the Richmond Police tells us the road from Londonderry to Richmond is cut in 3 places. That is...
You'd have the air traffic controllers and the police and the ambulance. Everything was happening all at once. And how he did that, I don't know. I've never seen anything like it then and never seen anything since.
In Perth, Lionel Lewis also held down the breakfast shift for 30 years on 6KY and later on 6pm.
Ladies and gentlemen, the Don Lund Show. The greater 3UZ.
3UZ in the 1960s put top disc jockey Don Lund into the breakfast shift, and soon a third of all radio sets in Melbourne were tuned to the man who called himself Mr. Fun.
Yes, he's all con and no tact. And away we go.
Don Lund, I believe to be one of the great breakfast performers. In his heyday, there was none better.
A brilliant natural comedian named Phil Haldeman came to 2SM as one of John Brennan's original good guys in the early 1960s.
It's 26.5 minutes to 9. Good morning, Sydney. Yeah. And good luck to you, mate. Thank you, Doc. Mr. Tom Jones now.
I remember Kevin O'Donoghue, the station manager at 2SM. Every time I did a really good show, he'd come in and say, "You had a late night last night, didn't you?" I say, "Yeah, how do you know?" He said, "You sounded great." And you know what it is. You stay up all night, you go in to do the show at 5 a.m, you know you're tired, you've got to make an extra effort, so you really rise to the occasion. But when you come off at 9, mate, you die. I mean, you just collapse, crash.
One of Australia's most talented comedians, top-rated in breakfast radio in Brisbane, Adelaide and Sydney. His name?
Malcolm T. Elliott.
See all those chairs out there? Yep. Well, I'm going to get all these chairs and I'm going to put them all up against the door, right? And I am not going to let anyone in, and I'm going to barricade myself into this joint, and I am not, and I repeat, I am not coming off the air.
I don't think Sydney had ever heard a breakfast show like it. It was the first of its type, with a whole lot of characters suddenly developed for this breakfast show, and that just happened by accident more than anything else. They were all around the building.
Yeah, a couple of other characters that we had in there were Richard Cranium. I wanted to have Mr. F. Witt, but they wouldn't let me. So we actually put forward Cranium and they let it roll.
When Elliott left Brisbane, his place was taken by another zany personality, Wayne Roberts, who became known to one and all as Waynie Poo.
Between 9 and 10 tomorrow, Waynie Poo takes you back with the hits of 1965. Love it.
A guy called up one day and he was as camp as our tents, you could tell it, and he said, "Is that you, Waynie Poo's there?" And like an idiot, I said, mate, don't call me Wayne Poosie. You know, you call me Wayne, you call me Wayne, don't call me Wayne Poosie. Because it was like a red rag to a bull. Every call that came through after that was, hey, Wayne Poosie, Wayne Poo. So, you know, my wife got Mrs. Pooh at Tuck Shop, and my kids got David Pooh, Karen Pooh, and they used to come home in tears, these poor little things. So Pooh stuck, so to speak. As it does to a rabbit.
One of Australia's highest rating breakfast shows in the 1970s and 80s was on Adelaide's 5AD, when Barry Eon and Tony Pilkington, known to everyone as Baz and Pilko, captured a staggering 40% of the audience.
You couldn't do it nowadays, but at the time, people said it's so bad it's entertaining. And it's so different, because we didn't really care. We were both single at the time, and we thought, we'll do this until we get sacked.
And it makes you wanna chuck just to earn a lousy buck. They work you like a fool. And the old lady comes in and she says, hey, what's up with you? Ain't you got respect? Pull your finger out or I'll break your bloody neck.
This crazy duo was so successful in Adelaide, they were soon offered more money to move east. Another of Adelaide's most successful breakfast men was John Vincent.
So we had a whole team of people around us, and it was like a zoo. And so we just had we just pretty much made it up as we went along. We did some preparation, but not a lot. A lot of it was just very spontaneous.
The 70s music formats spawned a rash of fast-talking, wise-cracking breakfast men who had to squeeze their jokes and stunts in between all that extra music. One of the most successful was Ian McRae at 2SM.
Well, good morning, 2SM for a brand new day. This is our first morning in our new studios here in North Sydney. And to celebrate the occasion, not tonight, but right now, we intend to release about 2,000 balloons from the roof of our new studio block. And each one of those balloons is tagged. Among those tags are many big cash prizes, and one of those tags says $1,270.
Ian McRae had an hilarious on-air sidekick who played the role of a somewhat dishevelled Member of Parliament.
He made up this character called the Hon Nick Jones. It was really a piss take on politicians. Everyone loved it so much, we thought we'd stand for election at the next elections. We stood for the Senate. And it was looking a bit hairy there for a while because we were watching the election night results coming in, and it looked very close. We could well have been voted into power in the Senate. Luckily, we just squeaked out because that could have been a disaster.
Callers are ringing up and mentioning names like Margaret Throsby, Jenny...
Other long-running breakfast stars include Mike Carlton, whose Friday News Review began in the 1980s.
Friday News Review with Roger Klingrap.
And so, President Long, say to you, just this, in respect of what my government and myself would seek an empirical understanding insofar as that our situation remained ongoing. Yeah, thank you.
In television, when I was at the ABC on This Day Tonight, we used to occasionally mimic Billy McMahon, who was Prime Minister then. You know, everyone could do a Billy McMahon voice. And, we'll win and we'll win well. And then it sort of grew from there. And that was a golden era. That was a bloody golden era when you had Billy McMahon, Bob Hawke.
Yeah, g'day, how you going, all right?
Whitlam, yes. And you had all those voices that were so send-upable. And it's never been quite the same since.
For the more sophisticated, there was Clive Robertson, who came to fame as a witty and erudite ABC breakfast host in the 1970s.
What do you mean with results?
Oh, Clive.
Come on now, I'm not...
When chamber pots are put into use.
Into use.
There we go.
There you go.
End of story. We have the gripe session today at 8:30.
I didn't understand that.
Didn't you?
No.
Thousands did.
Didn't you?
I think he's one of the most gifted broadcasters this country's ever produced. You don't get even one in a generation often. He understands the medium. He understands... I don't know that he actually does understand how funny he is, but I've got a shrewd feeling he does. And he has the ability to polarise audiences. People adore him and people loathe him. And I think that's pretty good.
Hello,
The coming of FM radio in the 1980s spawned another generation of comic breakfast announcers who cut their teeth on the comedy club circuit.
The Richard Stubbs Breakfast Show delivers wild entertainment and real music variety every morning, but...
Richard Stubbs found success by being completely unpredictable.
Not just your average breakfast show.
Yeah, but we're working on it. Be surprising, be unusual, and it's a lesson that... Actually, you know what? It's a lesson that the ABC push home now. Be surprising, be unusual, don't be regular, break the mould, give people a reason to not turn off and to listen in and to talk about. Did you hear? On the, promoting that kind of anarchy is great.
In Sydney, king of the Triple M breakfast shift in the 1980s and early 90s was the irrepressible Uncle Doug Mulray, who gathered round him a talented cast of comics.
Thank you so much. It's 9:15 for the digitally educated, 9:15 for the rest of us.
In the 1990s, as corporations began paying hundreds of millions for FM radio licences, breakfast radio became competitive and carefully planned. Teams of talented comedians, backed up by equally talented gag writers and producers, presented slick and very funny breakfast programs.
Wacky, hilarious, that's us. Rude, crude, that's him.
One of the most successful was Wendy Harmer,
Wendy Harmer, she's great.
who with Jamie Dunn, Peter Moon and Paul Holmes dominated Sydney breakfast ratings for most of the decade.
Peter and I, we used to go at each other hammer and tongs and have the biggest fights and rows. Hilarious, absolutely hilarious. And we were always betting each other things where if he beat me at something, I'd have to call him Lord Moon all week, you know. And then if I beat him, he would have to call me Princess Wendy and bring me cups of tea and all this sort of silliness.
Breakfast radio is very different to doing drive. Yeah. Drive's a lot more, you know, languid and a little bit, you know, sort of lugubrious. That's just another word that's very similar to languid, but I knew that you'd be impressed by it, Graham, because you wouldn't think a bloke with a head like mine would know what that word would mean.
What does it mean?
I went to the dictionary before I did this interview.
What does it mean?
Look, that's why I've only got two with L's. I only got to L.
What's lugubrious?
Same as languid.
What's languid mean?
It's like lugubrious.
Jackie O and Kyle Sandilands were dominating the national drive program on the Oz Stereo network when they were moved to the competitive world of the Sydney breakfast shift.
And if you move to breakfast and you don't do well, see you later. You don't get to go back to drive because you're just perceived as the failure, the people that couldn't make breakfast work. And you don't really get a second chance.
So you have a listen to the AM stations and you know, their listeners will get up and wait for their radio show to come on, and they will stay there all day and all night because they love that station. Where I think a younger generation picks radio shows like television, like they will go to a different destination to follow a show that they want rather than just listening to one radio station all day.
But just let me check exactly what the limitations are on all of that and I'll let you know.
Today, some of the highest rating breakfast shows are hosted by news commentators. And it's been a challenge for some of those talented broadcasters to compete successfully with comedians at 5:30 in the morning.
I'm not a good breakfast host because you may want some editorial in there. I'm surprised that Alan Jones so early can harangue people for so long because they want lots of traffic, they want some lightheartedness, they want some laughs. People getting out of the shower, having a shave, whatever, having their breakfast, having their coffee. They want light and shade at breakfast. They want quirky stories, quirky interviews, and I was my stuff was too heavy for that.
I think I do more homework than anybody. I don't take it off the front page of the Daily Telegraph. And so the my radio program is more than a mirror image of the print media.
I'll be back tomorrow morning at the same time between 5:30 and 10. Ray coming up after the news. Stay with us here on 2GB 873. See you tomorrow. Bye-bye.
As radio evolved, breakfast radio got slicker and more formatted. Next up, we leave the big cities behind and we take a look at the role of radio in the bush. From its very beginning, radio linked people over the vast distances of the Australian outback. Here to look back at radio's role in the rural community is one of the great stars of breakfast, the brilliant Wayne Roberts.
Thank you very much, Bobby. I appreciate that. I've been a city broadcaster in Queensland for most of my life, and I know how important country radio has been in the life of country people. When radio broadcasting began, there was an immediate demand from rural communities that were isolated by the vast distances of the Australian inland, who needed to have their own stations. Men and women out on the land and in the country cities and towns wanted radio to bring them the very latest stock and crop prices, weather reports, local news, and of course, entertainment. Some of our earlier stations operated in regional cities like Newcastle, Albury and Launceston. But ironically, it was those very distances and the sparse rural population of the time that actually forced early broadcasters out of business and led directly to the establishment of the ABC.
I was on air and I didn't realise that these women right on the border of New South Wales, South Australia and Queensland, that my female voice was in many cases the only female voice they heard. And they used to write in and say, you know, we talk to you, we've got your picture up on the radio, and we talk to you because you are the only female we come in contact with for weeks. And it just makes all the difference. So that gave me a feeling of being with them.
And then we've got 6 young ladies who are entered in the Miss Showgirl competition.
I read that. That's a lot of young ladies.
It is a community need, and the community knows that the radio will tell them, like flood, fire, all those emergency things. It can be more up to date than anything you can get ever. And the ABC's role in these areas is just so important. It really is.
Cold weather coming in, there's a sheep weather alert, or, you know, if it's lambing time, or if you've got your tractors or equipment out there and a couple of inches of rain is forecast. They need all this information, and the country stations provide it.
Well, first to the good rains for many parts of the state. With 50 mils near the Queensland border, reports of good falls in the west near Burke.
In those days, the radio station and the newspaper were the centre of the entire community. And the radio station in those days was in every bun fight. We broadcast Anzac parades locally. We went to balls. Frank, the White Rose Orchestra, was still around and came every so often, and we went across the road to the town hall at Moree and broadcast the White Rose Orchestra balls.
In each town, a few hard-working jacks of all trades created a solid local institution providing essential local information.
Then when you got there, you had to turn the transmitter on, and then you played march music or Slim Dusty or whatever you wanted to play to warm the thing up for 15 minutes. And then you came on the air and said 3BO Bendigo, the AWA station, and hit the gongs. The time is 5 o'clock or 6 o'clock, and that was it.
Country stations proved to be a perfect place for the would-be stars of radio to get their start. Those who made it in the big city mostly have fond memories of their days on a bush radio station.
You'd always read out, "We now present Hymns We Love" by a Warrnambool businessman who wishes to remain anonymous. Now, everybody for 100 miles in the Western District knew it was Fletcher Jones, and there was a song called Peace, P-E-A-C-E, in the garden. Lovely hymn from God knows where. And for whatever reason, I said, he's now 7:35 and we present, Hymns We Love by the bloke nobody wishes to know. And we've got Pat Boone here with a little piece in the garden. It struck me as funny, Pat Boone having a bit of a go in the garden. Didn't go down well, mate.
It was in country radio that Ian McRae first honed his comedy skills by staging practical jokes on fellow announcers.
We sprinkled the chook feed all round under the microphone desk. And then he came on the air and we opened the door very quietly and threw these chickens in. And they're all going, bah, 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 and then they all settled down. Of course, they found the chook feed. Now, he's trying to do a sporting show, and these chooks are around his feet going, bah, 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 and he's going,
We did football broadcasts. I became a football commentator. And I did all of these things. I wrote copy, I picked programs. I got into country music because of that, because I was picking country music programs. We had copywriting, we did programming, we did OBs. We did all sorts of things. We recorded commercials. In those days, all of our recorded commercials were on reel-to-reel recorder.
Many experienced radio people still say there's no substitute for a solid training in the bush.
When I left school at the age of 18, I started knocking on doors, and everybody knocked me back, including Lewis Bennett at 3UZ, and I remember Eddie Barmer saying to me at 3KZ, he was program manager there, he said, "You are lacking in the sum total of human experience," whatever that was. So he said, go to the country and learn your craft.
We've got Graham Hanger and the junior sport reporters in with us. How are you this morning?
I'm well, Jen, thank you very much. And there's some more young people coming in a little bit later on, so lots to talk about this morning.
There was a man called Sam Cronje who was doing the afternoon shift, Big Sam Cronje, and he said, well, if you stay here, hoping for your big break, whose job do you think you're going to get, Brian? Do you think you'll get Gary O'Callaghan's, Bob Rogers or John Law's? And I said, oh, right, good point. So I went away and got some experience in country radio.
The ABC's famous rural broadcasts began in 1947 with the Country Hour, which is still on air to this day. It was set up by a pugnacious and abrasive man named John Douglas, who'd organised massive vegetable farming operations for the army during the war.
Here to present the Country Hour is Graham McAfee.
The Country Hour was initially a single national program aimed at bringing the latest information on market prices and scientific farming methods to those working the land. But segments were soon added to concentrate on local weather and items specific to the climate of the region. And today, the show has separate editions in each state.
So for those crops still standing and likely to go through to harvest, what sort of yields do you think are realistic?
Eastern districts with better crops, particularly the later sown ones with conservative moisture. I mean, we might see yields over a tonne for some of those, but I think a lot of them are going to come in around that half a tonne mark.
Another long-running ABC program is Australia All Over, which links country and city listeners. For literally millions of Australians, Sunday morning will forever be associated with the laconic voice of Macca, Ian McNamara.
And after a while, you do it long enough, your style will come out and you'll develop, and that's how the programs just sort of grew, and people liked it because it was different. It sounded a bit different. We were talking about Australian things, and we weren't making fun of people who lived in the country and, oh, I'm Abel the cow and living in Gundy. We weren't doing any of that because because I'd known people in the country and they're just, clever, good people.
We play in our backyard. We used to bat towards the house and Mum said, don't bat towards the windows. So we made a rule. If you hit a window, you're out. Dad said, if you hit a window, you're out and dead.
Some say country people want news and entertainment piped in from the big cities, while others insist the local coverage is more important.
Yes, well, I mean, I think that the local community knew everything. I mean, it was a local news service and the radio gave you all the information, and it was very community oriented.
Today, with rural economies under pressure, country radio broadcasts more syndicated programs than ever.
Radio's fairly local, and that's what the people who know about radio say, that you've got to be local and in your market, but there are people and programs that have disproved that, and I think there's a place for all of it, of course.
There are those who argue today that localism is not so important and networking is the way to go. There are others, like myself, who argue, well, yes, a certain amount of networking is probably always desirable, but you must look after the local element.
Local or syndicated? The truth is, country people probably want a little bit of both. One thing is certain though, despite the internet and your iPods, country radio will survive, as it always has, by providing companionship and information to those ruled by the tyranny of distance. And coming up next, the fun and drama of radio's greatest stunts and promotions.
I guess I've always made sure I had fun as a broadcaster, both in radio and television. It seems that we Australians have always had a good, healthy sense of fun. We're happy to go with the gag and even get involved, and even occasionally make fools of ourselves, especially if there's a prize involved. In the days before television, when the biggest radio shows had 5 million listeners, Jack Davey and Bob Dyer managed to get 100,000 of their listeners to jam into the centre of Sydney to watch one of their crazy stunts. Now that's publicity.
All right, Mr. Mitchell, Mr.
Mr. Waymaker, your penalty will be to wheel this pram with Rod Holmes along Pitt Street tomorrow afternoon at 1:30 from King to Market Street. If you do that, you will come back here next Monday and receive £50 for paying the penalty. Can you take it? Yes. He can take it!
Around the time when the audience started getting up on stage as part of the show, the stunt became central to radio entertainment. Some of the early announcers projected their personality through simple stunts. One well-known breakfast man, John Hudson, staged the first April Fool's Day joke on radio by pretending there were sheep filling the city streets.
The panel operator's playing all these all these discs of sheep and playing over and getting more and more. And John said, wait till I open the window. And he pretends to open the window and the sheep get louder and louder. So I don't know what's going on, he said, but if you're in the area, you better come and have a look, there's something. And it stopped, traffic stopped and everything happened.
One night we said we were on the Sydney Harbour Bridge and we're doing it from the pylon.
That's right, too, does you go past.
So all these people were driving over the bridge going, that's where Jono and Dano
I can see him.
Yeah,
I can see him. We were still in the studio.
Some of Australia's most spectacular radio promotions were carefully planned to involve as many people as possible. In the 1960s, 2SM created mayhem when they planted a key to a car in a suburban street or park and then gave listeners clues to its location.
A gentleman here, a very smart gentleman, was on the scene, kicked the Marlborough box along, thought it was a bit on the heavy side, picked the Marlborough box up and there was the key sellotaped inside.
For a time, radio decided that the bigger the prize, the more the excitement. Stations gave away houses, and then what was at the time the biggest prize ever awarded in Australian radio, $1 million.
Hand is into the barrel, nothing up the sleeve, I might add. Mrs. Ellen Jenkins. Are you with us, Mrs. Jenkins? Congratulations to
you can have a kiss.
It's a bit of all right. Never kissed a millionaire before either.
Perhaps the most successful of all radio promotions was the one they called Rocktober.
The Rocktober one came about by looking for something that would last for longer than 2 weeks, so we wouldn't have to think of something else to run for the next 2 weeks. And a fellow that worked for us called John Torv, who I think is still around somewhere, and he was sitting in the back of the car when we were discussing it, and he just came up with it. He said, "What about this name, Rocktober?" And we went, "Yes, sir." So it immediately became our idea, and
Rocktober was huge. All the time Rocktober was huge. Probably the best one they did was, it's still on video somewhere, the big one at the Opera House with Dragon. You had your Skyhooks, Thin Lizzy, just huge, and like 70,000 people would turn up. Just a radio promotion.
A popular part of Rocktober was a toll-free morning on the Sydney Harbour Bridge.
Well, once again, Rocktober rolls around and here we are atop the Sydney Harbour Bridge, and today, once again, for motorists, put the 20 cents away because it's all free of charge. The toll is on us. The bridge is toll-free till 9:30 this morning.
2SM's Ian McRae also used the bridge for another outrageous stunt that people still talk about. The time a jumbo went under the bridge.
So my job was to, every day, do something on the air to gradually make people think it was going to be a 747. So we did this by doing like a call to the Boeing factory in Seattle, talking to one of the designers of the aircraft, and he was in on the gag. He knew what to say. And he said, "Oh yeah," he said, "probably could be done." He said, if the wind's in the right direction, you could bring a 747 under the harbour bridge, and you just might clip pinch gut, but you should be okay. So,
and here it comes now. What a sight. How can I describe to you? A great, enormous, huge elephant on a barge going under the bridge. Boo! Let's see how reaction is down there on the water.
The reaction was amazing on this side. People are going, never seen anything like it. Totally stunned.
I tell you what, Ian, if there are any rotten eggs and tomatoes around, I'd have copped them for sure. One woman told me she got up at 3 o'clock all the way from Mount Druitt to come and see an aeroplane come under the bridge, and she was most disappointed. She thinks you're a rat in the think.
The Australian sand and surf culture was always central to radio promotions. For years, radio stations have sent their promotional teams out to beaches to involve listeners in contests and give away sponsors' products. Perhaps the most spectacular was 2SM's massive Surfabout, which brought the world's greatest surfers to Australia.
And they were great. I mean, that was all part of it. I mean, we were like part of a surfing culture in those days.
Planned to coincide with periods when radio rating surveys were underway, these promotional stunts helped boost stations' audience figures and revenue.
Wednesday morning, 7:20, you can win $10,000 from 2UW, whether or no. Silly gimmicks.
Linking up with social issues has also proved successful for some radio stations. The ABC's Triple J is renowned for mixing rock music with a social conscience. But surprisingly, the pioneer in this field was a commercial station, Adelaide's 5KA.
5KA in the mid-70s went with a call sign of Earth Station 5KA. And it was an awareness of, an ecological awareness that was brought to us by some of the Adelaide community, people who'd basically read Lord of the Rings and realised the ecological significance of this book and the importance of you know, taking care of the land. And we saw it as being quite an important issue.
And we had a logo, which was a globe with two hands cupped around it, and the slogan, I care. And now music stations, everything else was top 40. The last thing they did was move down political paths. But we advocated, we campaigned against the Vietnam War, bring the troops home. It was a very socially active, aggressive radio station.
Radio has had to reinvent itself many times to stay in touch and be relevant to its audience. Having survived the challenges of television and lived through the rock and roll era, radio suddenly faced another revolution. Stations were finally permitted by the authorities to include telephone calls from listeners in their programs. Mike?
Gav, you're 100% right. In our next episode, we'll look at talkback radio. We'll also explore how the music stations staged their own revolution and how one man took ownership of rock and roll radio. It's an exciting story, so I hope you'll join us. I'm Mike Hammond. Bye for now.